Awesome. So my name is Rex. I am the program director here at the UIS Women's Center. We want to welcome everybody to this event. So this is a co-hosted event with the University of Illinois Springfield, specifically the Women's Center and the American Association of University Women. And we're very excited to put on this event. It's called What Does It All Mean? It's a post-election panel to just sort of talk about what are some of the outcomes and things of the election. We have a great group of 5 panelists tonight, so I'm going to have them really briefly introduce themselves. And so in no particular order, I'm going to start with Dr. Magic Wade.
Hi, I'm Magic Wade. I'm an assistant professor in political science at UIS, and I specialize in public policy, state politics, and public sector labor relations and public sector unions in my research, and I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Dr. Matt Garris.
Hi, I'm Matt Garris. I'm a professor in the political science department at UIS, and I teach American politics, particularly elections and national political institutions. This is my first semester at UIS, so I'm happy to be here with all of you today.
Thank you. Ralph Martiri.
Ralph Martiri, I'm the resident curmudgeon of the panel. I'm the executive director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, which is a bipartisan organization. I am also the Rubloff Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University.
Thank you. Rhiann Hawkins.
Sorry. Hey, everybody. I'm Rhiann Hawkins. I am the Deputy Director for Advocacy and Campaigns at Planned Parenthood Illinois Action. I'm also a proud UIS alum and an AAUW Springfield area branch member. Yay!
And finally, last but not least, Jenny Purdue.
Hi, I'm Jenny Purdue. I am the contractual lobbyist for AAUW Illinois and work in Springfield when we have session in Springfield.
Perfect. So some quick ground rules. So we have some prepared questions. If you as a audience member have a question at any point, please direct message them to me. Again, I am Rexanne Wharton with a W. Send them to me in a direct message. If a lot of the questions are pretty much like one of our prepared questions, we'll just maybe bump that prepared question forward. If it's something really different, we might bring it up. We want to make sure we get through a lot of these questions, but also have some chance for audience members to get at their ideas. But we're gonna start close to home in Illinois. And what are the standout differences you saw for Illinois in the 2020 election versus the 2016 election? And how might they impact politics over the next 2 to 4 years? And any of you can go first.
I can jump in, but I don't know that it was demonstrably like that crazy different here. Illinois is a blue state. It was a blue state in 2016. It's a bluer state in 2020. Maybe. So I think at least in this state, as far as the state legislature goes, nothing's really changed markedly. And you know, congressionally, I'd have to rely on other people, but even that, I mean, we're still counting some vote totals, you know, up in Lauren Underwood's race, but you know, I don't think we had a significant shift there either. So I think it's pretty the same.
I would just echo saying that in Illinois, the Democrats didn't lose ground like they did in a lot of states. So that's probably good news for them. But I mean, the loss of Betsy Londrigan to Rodney Davis was a big upset that I think, you know, people were really optimistic about. But at the state level, yeah, I mean, you know, we have a similar situation in terms of the elections. I think we'll get to the fair tax, but that is the thing with the biggest implications. I would argue, that happened in this election.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I think in the suburbs, we saw things were a lot closer than I think any of us anticipated. So like we had a victory in 2018 with Lauren Underwood, who represents the 14th congressional district, which are the exurbs of Chicago. And while votes are still being counted there, I don't think anybody anticipated it being as close as it's come down to. And, you know, us all refreshing the Lake County clerk's website every 5 minutes or so. So yeah, things just tightened up a lot, especially in the suburbs. And then here in central Illinois, I don't think that anybody was expecting the Londrigan loss to be as big as it was.
Perfect. Making sure. Okay. For a second, I thought I muted myself. So on that note, I think that we should just go ahead and get to the nitty gritty of the big state thing that happened and bring Ralph in to talk a little bit about that. Why did the fair tax amendment fail despite the implication a majority of Illinoisans would have lower tax bills? And what are the options for Illinois to raise tax revenue now?
Well, why it failed, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I think, first of all, people underestimate how difficult of a campaign it really was to wage, because you have to overcome a lot of preconceived notions that are anti-tax. In Illinois, even among Democrats, is not a very aggressive state from an increased tax policy standpoint. We have a lot of folks that are reticent to see the state raise additional revenue. And you may not believe this, but there's a little issue with trust somehow in elected officials in the state of Illinois. So it was very easy, I think, for a well-financed anti-fair tax effort to mislead the voting public into casting ballots against their own economic interest. And I think that's kind of amazing in one sense, because you compare us to Arizona. Arizona passed a tax increase on millionaires to fund education. Arizona is a much redder state overall than Illinois, and generally votes red. Yet they were able to get that done. And I think that just emphasizes the lack of trust in elected officials in our state. So it was an uphill battle. And you see that the ballot initiative actually carried 60% in Cook County and then failed miserably across the rest of the state. So the lack of trust issue puts us in a really rough situation, because Illinois' fiscal condition is something other than healthy. So I'm going to talk about what we missed out on from a fiscal standpoint and a little bit from an economic standpoint, and really what we can do to replace it. And the options in the toolkit aren't great. In fact, everyone that voted against the fair tax and isn't in the wealthiest 3% in Illinois voted to increase her or his own taxes, because there will be a tax increase. The state of Illinois has a $42 billion general fund budget. Only about 28 billion of that goes to current services. The rest is for hard costs like debt service, et cetera, et cetera. So we only spend 28 billion on current services, and we will end this fiscal year, after you account for the problems caused by COVID-19, with a deficit north of $14.5 billion, roughly 50% of our general fund expenditures on services. And that's where we'll be starting next year. So the state just can't deal with a problem that big without raising taxes somehow. And the first tax I think they will go after is the flat rate income tax, because it's easier to increase that tax than it is to do what's right with the sales tax, which is expand the base. A 1 point increase in the income tax, so going from its current rate of 4.95% to 5.95%, or call it 6, would generate about $3.7 billion in the current economy. That is roughly exactly what the fair tax would have generated. So I think that's the first place you should look for the state to go. I do think they'll consider expanding the sales tax base to services, but Pritzker made it clear that was not his first option. And I don't know that that'll get done this spring session, but it probably will happen in the next 2 years. And it should happen. Of the 45 states with a sales tax, Illinois literally has the most narrow base, meaning we tax less economic activity with our general sales tax than any other state in America with a sales tax. So even though our sales tax average rate, state and local, is relatively high, as Cook County and City of Chicago have really added on, the state rate's 5%. The local add-on is 1.25. So no matter where you are in Illinois, you pay a 6.25% rate at least as a sales tax rate. But in Cook County, it could be north of 10% in the City of Chicago. That said, despite our rate being relatively high, we actually raise less per capita with the sales tax than any other state in America. And that's because we tax so little of the modern economy. Our sales tax focuses primarily on the sale of products, things you can touch, and not services. That's a loser proposition because about 73% of the economic activity in our state today is the sale of services, whereas only about 17% is the sale of products. So those are two things they really have to look at. There's other stuff they have to do that doesn't involve tax policy to get their fiscal house in order, and it involves pensions. And I think we should talk about that later when we talk about pensions. But I will say this is a real missed opportunity. I don't know if you're familiar with the research of a gentleman named Joseph Stiglitz, PhD, Nobel Prize winning economist. He actually looked at what states did in response to the Great Recession to see whether austerity, cutting spending on services to balance your budget deficit caused by the Great Recession, or raising taxes progressively and investing in services worked better to help you get out of the recession and recover. And the answer is the latter worked much better. So those states that raised taxes on wealthy folks and invested that tax revenue in current services actually recovered significantly faster than states that mostly relied on spending cuts to balance their budget. And the reason for that has everything to do with consumer spending. Really rich folks have seen their incomes grow so much that when you tax them a little bit more, they don't spend less in the economy. That's important because 67% of all economic activity is consumer spending. Well, guess what? They don't spend less. You take that revenue and you spend it on public services at the state level. That's where 96% of your expenditures roughly go to education, healthcare, social services, or public safety. Or you could hear that as the salaries of teachers and social workers and healthcare providers and correctional officers and university workers. So those are middle income folks who tend to spend all their income. So the net impact of all this is a positive multiplier of up to $1.50 for every dollar you raise in taxes. So we could have generated close to $6 billion in private sector economic activity in Illinois during this recession caused by the pandemic if in fact we'd have passed the fair tax, but we lost that opportunity. We are now going to have substantial spending cuts, and I'm willing to wager the state's economy is going to take longer to recover than our neighboring states. All good news.
Thank you for that very thorough answer. Does anybody else have anything to add on the fair tax?
I'll maybe just say something briefly about ballot initiatives more generally.
Perfect.
Oftentimes, it's not about what the actual ballot initiative or the constitutional amendment says on the ballot. It becomes about competing narratives. And I think that was very much the case here, where if you've seen any of the advertisements or the commercials, it wasn't, oh, we're going to propose, we're going to eliminate the required flat tax amendment in the Constitution, or the flat tax provision in the Constitution, and then of course that was partnered with the tax bill that the legislature had passed and would go into effect in January. It was about, oh, do you trust politicians to not raise your taxes at a later date, or do you trust politicians to not tax your retirement income? And I think that probably went a long way in the outcome as well. Just the competing narratives.
Thank you. So switching gears a little bit, and this I think several folks will have something on this, but Matt, you might be a good person to start with, not to put you on the spot, but if looking at the federal level, if you had to wager a guess, what do you think we're going to anticipate out of a Biden White House in the first 100 days?
Yeah, so I think right now that's maybe a little bit of a difficult question to answer, just because in Georgia, both Senate races have gone to a runoff. So John Ossoff will run against incumbent Senator David Perdue, And then Kelly Loeffler will face Raphael Warnock in a runoff. So both of Georgia's Senate seats are still on the line. And if the Democrats win both seats, that would lead to a 50-50 split in the Senate, which then, of course, would allow Vice President Kamala Harris to cast the tie-breaking vote. So that has pretty wide-sweeping implications for what Biden can address and the Democratic Party can address legislatively. More directly, regardless of those outcomes, we'll almost certainly see Biden take a lot of executive action in his first couple weeks and months in office. And this is pretty typical anytime the White House flips from one party to the other. So in particular areas that Biden's already kind of announced or his team has already announced that they'll address, we'll probably see him take executive action to reverse a lot of the restrictions or lack of restrictions that Trump has put in place in terms of environmental protections. That's one area. And then we'll also see him address where he can, and this is more questioning legally what he can do and what he can't do, the issue of immigration. And then I think finally, I think another area is legislatively and what he can do in terms of executive action. I think addressing COVID recovery will be almost certainly one of the biggest priorities. Biden's already announced that he hopes to have Congress pass another relief bill. And beyond the types of things that we've seen in the previous relief bill, he's mentioned that he'd like to see the creation of a task force that specifically looks at the racial and ethnic disparities that COVID has caused and its impact. He wants to expand testing and personal protective equipment. And he also mentioned within a COVID relief package, the possibility of canceling student debt. So those are kind of some of the things I see taking place. And then, of course, as I mentioned at the outset there, if the Democrats do end up getting control of the Senate, or at least the 50-50 in the tie-breaking vote, that really expands their options in terms of what they want to pursue legislatively. And if they can't get the majority in the Senate, then they're going to need to focus more on bipartisan or what they can get the Senate Republicans to agree to.
I want to ask a question of the panel if I can, that's related. So I know we've been looking towards getting some sort of COVID relief package, or there's so many hanging variables out there, from PPP loans to just are we going to have payments out to people again? Are we going to have state and federal or state and local funding put in there? And I know that was a dance that we were all doing before the election. I assume that now that there's so much uncertainty about what's happening in the Senate that there is not going to be anything that could happen before we know the outcome of the Georgia races, that there's no reason for the Democrats to negotiate something with the Republicans if they don't have to. But then I also was listening to a podcast that was talking about how much, how many millions of dollars or billions of dollars that can leave on the table of pushing those recovery and stimulus, down the road. So do we all think that the dystopian idea that we're not going to get anything for all the people who are in need because we need to wait for the politics to sort itself out is what's going to happen? Or is there any way that we could have a tiny package and then a second better package once we get Democrats in? So that's my question.
My organization's been involved a little bit in some of the discussions going between the Beltway and the state. And I got to tell you, there's not a lot of optimism that a lot's going to happen between now and a Biden administration. It's just not. I mean, certainly a lot of rank and file legislators, and frankly, in both parties would like to do something. The leadership is almost always the problem, whether you're at the federal or the state level. And it's certainly the problem here. I don't see any way a Trump administration is going to be willing to do anything rational, because that's in their modus operandi anyway. But certainly now he's less rational than even before. Mitch McConnell is an iron block, and so And the saddest part about that is, there's a lot of sad parts, but obviously, the quicker the stimulus money gets in, the quicker the recession ends and the faster the recovery. This is cutting off your nose to spite your face for politics. This is really about as bad as it goes. And second, if you look at the destruction caused to the economy by COVID-19, it's 80% of the job losses have been in the bottom 2 wage quintiles. So this recession has disproportionately hammered low and low middle income workers. And they are going to be put in some very, very difficult situations. And it's not like, they'll initially turn to their state governments for support. Well, state governments aren't going to have resources. 49 of the 50 states have balanced budget requirements. And according to the National Governors Association, this is kind of old, but their initial estimates of the impact COVID-19 would have on their state fiscal systems was a loss of between $500 to $600 billion in revenue. So we're talking about a time when the federal government really ought to be stepping to the plate to provide a very material stimulus program, and sooner than later. And by waiting, the economic devastation, and particularly for low and low middle income families, is going to be really, really outrageous.
Any other panelists want to chime in on that one? And this could be about that question that Ginny posed to the rest of the panel, or it could be about the Biden administration as a whole.
Well, should I just stop talking, because I always have bad news?
No, no, you're good.
Get
You're
somebody
good.
else to talk to say
You're
something good.
I can personally say that anytime you're talking about money or budgets, it's almost never the news you want. So I appreciate that. Switching over, since we just talked about the Biden administration, going ahead and riffing off of that, and then I think we're going to touch on some issues with women. But at first, I want to ask specifically about the Electoral College, because this has become a very big trigger point issue in our country, in our nation's politics this century. For those of you on the call, I know we have people of all ages on the call, but some of you may know that in the past, since the turn of the century, we've had two elections now where the person who won did not win the popular vote. They won the Electoral College. And what do we see as the future of this institution? And do we foresee successful paths towards a reform or even an abolition of the Electoral College? Anybody?
No, I think no, that will never happen, because there are so many state legislatures that are dominated by one political party that has no interest in having the elections decided by the popular vote. There are states that are just grossly overrepresented in the Electoral College, and they know it and they're happy about it. And so, it's going to never happen. So I just, I appreciate that, when one party seems to feel like they lose the Electoral College, they talk about, wanting to reform it. But if the other party is losing it, they're going to talk about it a little bit too. And I just think that's unlikely to happen. I do wonder, though, if Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. can ever get representation. I think that is more likely to happen. Now, that would that's a big thing that would require, democratically controlled everything. And so I would be curious to see if that's possible, but still, there are so many Republican controlled state legislatures that would absolutely oppose that, unless something, those voting blocks are so tight in Puerto Rico and DC that I think that's very unlikely, but never know.
I tend to agree with everything Magic just said. I think it's very unlikely. I think abolishing it is almost certainly never going to happen. Probably the best chance for anyone who's in favor of reform is what's known as the National Popular Vote Compact. And what essentially this compact is that basically individually, each states in their legislatures can determine that they will award their electoral college votes to the winner of the popular vote, opposed to the national popular vote, opposed to the winner of the popular vote within the state. And so far, 15 states have agreed to this national popular vote compact. And those 15 states amount to 196 electoral college votes. And Illinois is one of these 15 states. So for this policy to take effect, they would need states possessing another 74 electoral college votes to join this compact. And throughout history, since this reform has come about, there's been another 9 states where the legislature has passed this reform in one of their legislative chambers, but not the other. So that's a problem. And then I'll also just add it again, because I started by saying I mostly agree with everything Magic said. And I think even if enough states were to pass this, that we get to the point that it's 270, it almost certainly would be challenged in court. And then it's who knows what happens.
I just want to add, to put a fine point on Matt's, like the possible things that could happen to spur reform. So as of yesterday, so election results are still coming in a couple states. Republicans had majorities in 59 of the 99 state legislative chambers, and Democrats had 39 of these chambers. So, there's all these Republican state government trifectas. If we are going to assume that Republican governments are, or chambers are less likely to support this legislation, to, maybe join this compact or do things that would, amend the Constitution. So, national victory gets a lot of attention, but these state legislatures and the margins at which, one thing I observed in the, electoral map is that the Democrats won their races by really narrow margins in a lot of states. There are some really, really, really Democratic states, but there are a lot more solidly Republican states than solidly Democratic states where the margin's 20, 30%. So those aren't going anywhere.
And there was a follow-up question to the Electoral College question before we move on. And this probably is a Magic question because you brought it up. How would the Electoral College votes be distributed if we added more states or representation? So probably specifically that Puerto Rico, DC group.
By population?
Okay. Would it still be 538 or would it increase the overall number?
I think they might have to reapportion the whole thing. I don't know. I've never really thought about it that much, but I guess that's what they would do.
Perfect. Okay. So moving on, kind of to talk a little bit about, so in 2018, we experienced what was called the second year of the woman. And then 2020, we saw a surge in Republican women gaining office, in some cases unseating some of the Democratic women who just gained office. How do we foresee this impacting the two parties, and can we expect to continue to see upticks in representation of women in parties and even at the state levels? So.
I think that's a really good question. We would love to see more women get involved in the process for sure. We don't know how these women are going to vote when it comes to public policy, though. So I think it might be a mistake just to assume that because you're electing a woman, that means you're getting a pro-woman agenda or a pro-progressive agenda or a pro-progressive light agenda, if it happens to be a Republican woman. I don't think you can make that assumption. I think the Republicans probably did a really good job of recruiting this time. I'm not privy to their process, but as we know from research, and I'm sure Magic can talk to this, it's tougher to get women to put their name on a ballot. It just is, regardless of party. So I think having more women involved in the process is helpful on a number of different levels, but we don't know how those women are going to use their innate skills when it comes to making public policy on the other end.
Sure, I'll, 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 jump in because my name is thrown out there. So I agree that the Republican Party recruited women hard in 2020 because they were, I mean, in particular, some of the Republican, currently members in the House, one person in particular, Elise Stefanik, she started a PAC that was aimed at recruiting Republican women. Because if you don't recruit women, if you don't tell them, hey, you should run for office, they won't. The Democrats have been recruiting women at the state, local, national level and been successful. And that's why representation in the US Congress isn't 5%, because the Democrats have had a bunch of women in there and the Republicans haven't. And, this is something that when the recruitment efforts exist, the voters are not opposed to electing women. Republican voters don't care about if you're a woman or a man, they vote for the party. They do care about the ideology. So I think it's absolutely to what Rianne said, that you're not going to see more moderate Republican women being elected in certain places. I mean, there might be some districts where, yeah, they're going to elect a moderate man or a woman, but for the most part, the people who are going to get elected are going to seem very representative of your typical Republican, even if they're a woman. That's a little different from the model of Republican women that were elected in the 90s and that kind of first big wave of women. So if you think about like Susan Collins of Maine, she's one of the only people in the Senate that's congratulated Joe Biden on winning the election. So, there's been a history of some of the older, maybe women who felt like they were around long enough that they could oppose kind of the party line a little bit and work across the aisle, but they don't always do it. That's the other thing. I mean, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, she's also been somebody who has stepped outside of the Republican dominant, party line in certain times. But, she has to risk losing her election to the voters because the voters don't like that. They want Republican women, or Republican whoever. And so I think it is also interesting that when these women were recruited from the Republican Party to run, they recruited really good candidates who they won. They flipped seats the Democrats previously had. So of the, I think it's currently 9 seats that were flipped from Democrat to Republican in the House, like 8 of those elections were won by women. They did, found really great candidates. And then the last thing I'll say is, one thing that's, I just was like looking up some of these candidates that had won, and one of them is this woman, Nance Mace, and she's from South Carolina. And she was like this graduate of the South Carolina Military College, the first woman, and she wrote a book about it. And she gives this talk about, being part of the American dream. If you've listened to her and see her ad, you might think she was a Democrat. I mean, she grew up, working class. She's a single mom. She's the second single mom in Congress. And, she's even talking about COVID like it's real. She says, I had COVID. I'm still recovering. You should wear a mask. You should socially distance. Her policies are very conservative, but her image is one that I think I could see a lot of voters just thinking like, okay, well, this seems like someone who's just sort of like, they're not really far in either direction, even if their policy positions are. That's the thing, that like image, that brand that people project is really important for the voters. And clearly it was effective in this cycle. And I think it'll continue to be effective as a strategy moving forward.
So I think this is a good segue into, so this is sort of a federal and a state question, but also has a lot to do with women and grassroots efforts. So I think a lot of people were shocked when Georgia flipped blue, and the credit goes a lot to the grassroots organizing by people like Stacey Abrams, and I there's a whole list of women who worked in those organizations. Stacey is a really famous one, obviously, but so what lessons does this teach activists, sort of young and old, about how they might get involved in this work, either on the state level or on the federal level? And this could be this could be a tax initiative thing too, Ralph. I don't know, like, how do you get a ballot initiative? How do you be an activist? So yeah, any of you feel free to answer.
Illinois doesn't really have a ballot initiative process, so we're not a state where that's going to be happening. So it's not going to be here. We're not California, And that can be both good and bad.
I've been giving this a lot of thought in the last week, and I think everyone's searching for answers on different how the election turned out the way it did. Especially here in Illinois. I was hearing projections that we were gonna, or that the Democratic Party was going to pick up a lot of seats, and that ultimately didn't happen. And why is that? And I think this gets to what you were talking about, Rexanne, with just a grassroots effort. And I think the fact that a lot of campaigns sidelined their grassroots efforts. There were no door-to-door efforts. And that was done on purpose. I talked to a number of the campaigns, and that was done on purpose to keep everybody safe. Totally valid. But because we didn't do that, and because things like that weren't done around fair tax, which I think could have been very beneficial had there been an aggressive field operation going around fair tax, we saw, a lot of some incumbents lost. We saw a lot of seats that should have been picked up during a Biden sweep in Illinois lose. And the fair tax should not have lost by as much as it did if there had been an aggressive campaign, door-to-door campaign, where you're actually talking to voters and you're actually talking to them about issues and you're explaining to them, and they're not just seeing it on television. They're not just seeing the narratives, as Matt talked about earlier, about the ballot initiatives and buying into it. They're actually having a conversation and understanding the reasons to vote for a candidate, the reasons to vote for a ballot initiative, all that kind of stuff. I really think the lack of door-to-door hurt a lot of efforts. And I think the fact that Abrams and her group and groups in Arizona that were organizing around the Latinx vote, they all did field work. They all did door to door. They all talked to each other. And when you take that away, it isn't the same.
I agree completely that the lack of canvassing by the Democrats in particular, because I anecdotally have heard that in some places Republicans were still canvassing on certain issues in particular, or at least putting out a lot of mailers, or putting a lot of things on doorbells, and maybe not talking to people, but handing out a lot of information. One thing that may have really helped Georgia is, even if they weren't doing the direct, they already built that big, groundwork, right? So that was already sort of there that they could activate with digital. But I also think that a big part of the Georgia strategy rested on the youth vote. And so you have this voting bloc that came out in just enormously huge amounts this time compared to the previous elections. And in Georgia, the percentage of the electorate that was 18 to 29-year-olds was 21%. And I'm thinking that's a group of voters that responds to digital outreach. That's a group of voters that if you're unable to come to the door, and have a conversation with them, they're the ones you need to hit hard with that kind of mobilization. And maybe in the states where the youth voter turnout wasn't as high, they didn't do that as much at the state level, like really supplement with digital, because what else were you going to do? Essentially. So
I think everyone is on like 100% right. I would like to add, or at least maybe underline, that one of the reasons why Georgia flipped was because of the voter registration of voters who hadn't been registered to vote before and who had less access to do that. And I think a lot of what we're seeing, like in Arizona and in Georgia, and maybe Florida someday, is when we expand who the voters are. And I think finding those more marginalized communities and getting folks registered to vote is in some ways more impactful than just turning out vote, is identifying and because she registered 800,000 new voters since the last election. That's not the vote total difference. She registered that many. That's not how many turned out. So I think really looking at, getting new voters in the pool is a place where I think that that blue success, if you are a Democrat, is what you want is to bring new voters in and a lot of them, because that's where you're going to find the best gains. Getting someone who's already a voter to switch their vote is going to be much more difficult. And so I think finding ways, I think, the mail-in ballots are also another thing about that. That is another place of how we can reach maybe people who are already registered but don't normally vote. So I think underscoring bringing more engagement is, I think, a positive way of organizing and being involved in getting involved in advocacy.
I completely agree with that. I just want to add that the Republicans in certain states registered a whole bunch of new voters too. So I was actually really surprised that Biden won Pennsylvania because the Republican Party, registered almost twice as many new voters as the Democrats. And, there's the political science literature goes back and forth about what if everyone voted, it would always favor Democrats because the people that don't vote, they're poor and they're, people of color. And they always like try to model this, and they're often that is not the outcome that is found, is that, if you do register more people to vote, a lot of people will vote, it'll split in certain ways depending on the state that you're in. And so I think, when you see those big gains among certain demographics, so clearly, in Georgia, registering young voters, people of color, the Latino vote was way bigger than, 10% more Latinos, 60% voted in 2020 compared to 50% in 2016. They did not all vote for Joe Biden, and Texas, like some of these places, Florida, you've got these big pockets of Latinos who are really diverse. There's so many different perspectives. And so this voter registration, you're right, people aren't switching their party back and forth. That's a myth. There's, margins of that, but the voter turnout thing, I think that's great for democracy. Good, whether it favors one party or the other, just seeing this much participation makes me really, really happy as an American. So that's an optimistic thing that I'll say.
Thank you. And I think we did, one of the questions was on youth voting, but I'll just kind of hit the secondary part of that question. Do you think that youth voter engagement was very specific to these circumstances? Or do you think we're going to continue to see these youth voters engaged? Anybody?
I feel like that depends on if we are still dealing with a pandemic. I think a lot of, I think about UIS as a campus, and there's a lot of peer pressure that goes into, if all of your friends are voting, then I'm voting too. And unfortunately, that community was not there, and you can replicate that on every college campus in the state. But I think, it's incumbent on all of us as activists and all of you as active in your community to help keep that up, keep pushing out those messages about how important it is to vote, because we know from studies that if you vote 3 times, then you're a habitual voter and you're always going to vote. So we just need to get them 3 times. So we've got 1 in the bank, let's do 2 more, and we know we got them. So
that's one thing I think in terms of the Georgia Senate runoff elections, I'll be really curious to see if the youth vote is as enthusiastic after the big prize is, the big contest already happened. These are huge, obviously, but if you are a newer voter that's not really, really engaged, you were paying attention to the presidential election, Biden won, you're calling it a good. If that outreach isn't there, just like Rianne said, if there's not outreach to say, you got to come out again, you got to vote again, then, this could be not the same outcome as we saw in the state. So that'll be really pivotal to see if that 22% of the electorate is the youth vote again during those runoff elections.
So I have a question in the chat that I want to address, and I'm going to creatively rephrase it. As we know, statistics, at least, so this is the preliminary statistics, right? We don't know exactly, but it appears that about 91% of Black women broke for Biden versus 45% of white women. And of course, Black women were huge activists in many states, getting, obviously, again, Stacey Abrams, all of those women, but in many other states as well. So one of the things I hear a lot is that Black women are taken for granted by the Democrat Party. So what role are they going to continue to play, and how do you see, what do you see as the things that they're going to be looking for from the Democrat Party if they're going to continue to be that linchpin? Not to pick on you, Magic, but I think you might have some perspective on this.
I mean, one of the things that enables the Black voting demographic, in particular Black women who vote a couple percentage points more likely than Black men for Democrats, even though it's the margin, so like 12% of Black men voted for Trump apparently, but like only 8% of Black women or an independent. So they're the most, decisively Democratic voting bloc. Well, I think that means it's very easy to get left behind, because where are you going to go? I mean, the voters who are going to get courted. So it's not just saying, so yeah, the Democratic Party is going to count on those votes. That's going to change election outcomes in really important ways. We've seen what happens when there's a lack of enthusiasm among Black women. And, when there's enthusiasm, they get results. And I think that because the Republican Party's policies or rhetoric have not been welcoming to many Black women. I mean, there's here and there a couple Black women who've run for Congress, who've been in Congress, but not many. I think because of that, there's not really anywhere for them to go. And I think that the Democratic Party needs to get really, really pushed on what are you doing for like Black voters, really? Because that's why Latinos are like, hey, we're up for grabs. Who is gonna like offer policies that we care about? And, a very diverse group of people. And I would argue that Black voters are also diverse, but we treat them like they're not. We're like, because they vote like of any category, of any race, gender, Black women are the most like consistently Democratic. So of course they're going to get pigeonholed like that. And I think that's problematic because they have a diversity of views. And I mean, here's, a bunch of white people talking about Black women's views. So, that's a problem as well when you have panels like this. And, the Democratic Party needs to really think about it. And the intergenerational or the generational differences among Black voters are also really important. So young people of color have different ideas about public policy than Black people who've been in Congress for a long time and maybe have, a different view of the solutions that need to happen. So, I mean, there's so much diversity within these categories, but not in the party that they support. And yeah, I think we need to keep this on the agenda because it's something. And maybe, Kamala Harris is a person who's going to be in leadership power. I mean, there's going to be Biden's cabinet is going to be diverse. No one's brought this up yet. He's going to nominate a very diverse cabinet. And I hope that he elevates women of color to say, hey, you need to have decisive roles in policy.
I just want to make sure if anyone else had responses to that.
No, I was just going to say, echoing Magic's last point, I believe Joe Biden also pledged to put a Black woman on the Supreme Court if he has an opening as well.
And hopefully it's Anita Hill. I'll say that.
We can all dream. That would be interesting. I got a really good question in the chat that kind of mirrors some of the questions earlier about what are we going to anticipate from Biden when he takes office. So assuming the legal challenges to this election run dry, which many already have to acknowledge, but some are still continuing, what do you think we can anticipate from the current administration between now and January 20th, just based on what we've seen thus far? I'm seeing some, I don't know, and that's okay if we don't know, but
I think it depends if Donald Trump wants to like go golfing a lot or if he's like going to be really angry. So like in my like not knowing that world, but like I think he is I anything that they do is can be overturned, like any executive order that he issues or anything can be, on day one of the Biden administration can be like recalled. So even if they did things, I mean, I think it's going to be sort of like when Trump was like, oh, I'm going to change unemployment insurance for everybody, and like nobody could take advantage of it because the structure wasn't there to do that. Like he can kind of do whatever he wants to do, but like what impact is it going to have? Like no one's going to start polluting a lot more for 2 months, then turn around and like stop polluting when Biden gets in. So I think the guy's just going to go golf or like be on Twitter or something,
I'm curious to see what the Republicans in the Senate will do. I mean, we're seeing a little bit of that right now while they let the challenges play out. But there's just been such a minority of members of the Senate who've been critical of Trump and the Congress in general. And will that grow if they don't fear, retribution? I think how the Senate behaves is sort of a bellwether, how the Republicans in the Senate, and I mean, the House, they're out of power, but in the Senate behave as a bellwether for what will happen next time the Republicans have a chance to run for president, because it's going to show where the party's going. If it's pulling away from Trump, well, that's one thing. If it's staying close, it's because they know that their voters want them to. They're not stupid. They know their voters are like, you need to be nice to Trump. Because, I mean, or if he's totally disempowered because the voters are like, yeah, we're losing our enthusiasm. I think it's going to be the former. And there'll be a similar pattern that we've already seen in terms of that kind of circling the wagons around the president. And I think that's, something that gives us clues to where the party system is probably heading. But I don't know.
And then
I agree with what Magic just said completely. In fact, Trump got 7 million more votes this time around than last time around. 7 million. I mean, if you were ever going to have a landslide blue election, right? Trump is the guy to get it against. I mean, you got a candidate who's immoral, incompetent, and brutish. And despite all that, and despite his tremendous failure in handling the pandemic, which it got 7 million more votes, and he's the first, I think, Republican to get over 10% of the Black men to vote for him since George Herbert Bush. Is that right, Magic? Do I have that right?
It was 12%, I think.
Yeah. So,
I mean, polls.
So the Trump's not going away.
Yeah.
And Trump's approach to politics is not going away. And I think that creates a unique challenge for the Democratic Party to try to find a way to, I don't know a better word to use, to be less tribal in the way they assess people. I mean, they assume all Latinos are this way and all Blacks are that way and it's just wrong. People are diverse irrespective of their cultural background, their ethnicity, or their race. And you need to understand what they're really motivated to see happen in policy. And then when it comes to moderate to low income to poor whites, and the Democratic Party has a long way to go to try to rebuild bridges there. And one of the things Trump did, and it's been effective, sadly, in most countries, was he used populism in the worst way, right? To appeal to people's worst instincts, give them someone who doesn't look like them to blame for their problems and say, and the Republicans saw that was highly effective. So I think the need to heal the nation and become less divisive is not only paramount, it's going to be hard. And I think Republicans are going to dig in a little bit around this approach to politics. So it's going to take a lot of work to overcome that. But Trumpism isn't going away.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up just because, so this is sort of the capstone of almost 2 weeks of election programming on campus and in the community. And one thing that's come up a lot, and this is particularly for our students, is that there is a feeling, even amongst people who wouldn't consider themselves moderates either way, that there should still be a way to build bridges, right? That once upon a time, and and maybe this is a good old days rhetoric, but once upon a time, people worked across the aisle, and even if they were quite conservative or quite liberal, they could find places where they could come together on certain issues. And what a lot of our students are seeing is that folks can't talk to each other anymore, that people, that there isn't an effort by our elected officials to work across the aisle. What perspective, I mean, you've talked some perspective, but like what is kind of, I hate to say going wrong with our democracy in this way, and how, what advice would you give for students towards pushing their elected officials towards that work?
So I potentially have a lot to say about polarization, but I'll try and keep it relatively brief. At the congressional level, part of the reason why we're so polarized is in our current political environment, any midterm election can sway which party controls Congress. And because of that, they don't have an incentive to work together. They have an incentive to actually, whichever party's in the minority, they have an incentive to block every piece of legislation and then blame the majority for doing nothing. More largely in the mass public or among voters, polarization. More recently, like the research on polarization has come up with this theory called affective polarization. And essentially what affective polarization argues is that we're not nearly as divided on policy issues as we necessarily think, but we absolutely hate the other political party. So this is also sometimes called negative partisanship. So you might be a Democrat and you probably hate the Republican Party more than you like the Democratic Party, and vice versa. You might be a Republican, but you probably hate the Democratic Party more than you actually like the Republican Party. And I think we actually saw this election cycle some really, really good evidence of this in Florida. Essentially, since 2012, when Obama was reelected, Florida's been a very red state at the national and state level. They've elected 2 Republican governors, 2 Republican senators, and voted for Trump twice. But this year they passed a $15 minimum wage as a ballot initiative. And in 2018, they voted to restore voting rights to ex-felons. So I think that's one example of, we maybe don't necessarily agree on some of these policies, but if it's the opposite party proposing the policy, we're not willing to agree to it.
I love that you pointed out that the policy, when you remove the policies from the parties, a lot of voters don't fall in line with where they think they should. And I noticed this in my students and in my teaching, because I teach public policy courses. And I hope that I am known for proposing a lot of things that challenge the common wisdom about what the effects of a policy are, and ways to analyze policy from different perspectives and different arguments that don't map neatly onto like the polarization that exists. And over time, policies become more polarized, like COVID-19 mitigation and the response. It was, and the vaccine, like these things weren't polarized, and then they become that way. And like that sort of thing happens when the parties capture it, essentially. But when you get at the micro level and actually just have people have these conversations, it's the mass public, I mean, I would argue, is not as extreme in their views as the elites in the whole. Now, there's a lot of very extreme people, and I'm not saying there aren't, and they're not going anywhere. And there's a lot of geographical sorting. So the people that are very extreme don't ever talk to people that disagree with them. They really avoid people like that. They hate them. There's all this tribalism. But I do think it's affective. It is very much like a feeling about those people rather than like certain, you know, the nuances of every single policy thing. And I think it also shows why like the fair tax didn't pass. The people that voted for Biden and voted for Pritzker did not vote for this policy. If that's not a good example of like the ways that people navigate these policy choices based on their self-interest or their perception of like what they think the government should be doing, you know, that isn't just polarized, I don't know what is. And I think the vaccination debate that's going to happen over the next year is going to be a really good example of polarization gone amok.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys are 100% right. But a thing I think I have gleaned from working in state government is that we all agree on the problems. I mean, there's like one or two legislators who are off in their la land who don't agree on the same thing. But when we're looking at, you know, we're going to be facing a giant budget hole next year. Everyone who's coming in, you know, Democrats and Republicans are going to know we have a budget hole this year, and they don't want to cut services down to the bare bones. I mean, that's why we don't vote for that year after year after year. So like a lot of the, I find it frustrating. You know, when you have a conversation with a legislator in their office about like a complex policy issue, and where the Democrats are and where the Republicans are, you know, right here, but it's these little pieces. And then, but when that gets disseminated to the voters, it's not portrayed as that they're really right here. It's portrayed as if they're over here. And I have a hard, you know, with my friends and family trying to communicate that, like, no, I'm having the face-to-face conversation. I know where these people are, like, where you're at is you're in la la land, because what you're saying is like, it's like playing telephone. And I think that I don't know how to fix this, and I don't know even if the thing that I'm pointing to is the thing to fix. But I do feel like from what happens when you're looking at policy and trying to find solutions to policy, and then the telephone game that gets to the voters, that's a problem. Like, I think I don't know if we were better at it before, or if people just cared, like there was less information to have before. I don't know what it is, but that like, here's the problem, here are some solutions, you know, choose multiple choice of how to get to fix the problem. But instead it turns into like, you know, just Looney Tune stuff that you hear coming from both sides out and about. And I have to correct family and friends on Facebook on both sides of the aisle and say, this isn't true, can you take this down? Like, it's hard. And it's like my very, very liberal friends, and it's my very, very conservative, you know, family members that both are sharing incorrect information, which I think just makes it worse. And so I don't know how to fix that, but I wish there was a way we could disseminate what the actual problems are and what the actual solutions could be in a less polarized way, I guess.
Well, there's a lot of challenges with that, Jenny. I think you're spot on. You know, my organization, go back to the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. So my board of directors has Democrats and Republicans on it, right? And the idea is to try to take partisan rancor out of the discussion and focus on policy initiatives that are designed around best practices. And you can have rational discussions with elected officials, and you're right, find them relatively close to each other. But then and I'm sure you've had this experience, they'll look you in the eye and say, but I won't be able to sell that to my constituents because they won't believe it. So literally the elected official is saying their constituents are the problem, and they don't have the time, the money, or the effort to educate their constituents. And so it's where the individuals they represent get their information. And now we have all these self-reaffirming avenues to get our information from, right? We never have to hear an opposing view if we don't want to. And that's, in my mind, really one of the worst things that happened. That, and frankly, the loss of adequate resources for journalists to do their jobs. and which they can't do anymore. So now instead of actually vetting what a politician says from either party and knowing, you know, the accuracy or inaccuracy of any claim they're making around a specific initiative, they basically said, well, Sally on the Republican side of the aisle says X, and Billy on the Democratic side of the aisle says Y. I've presented both sides. There's balanced reporting. No, no, you haven't exposed the inaccuracies in both sides. I do a lot of, well, at least before the pandemic, I did a lot of public speaking around Illinois and nationally. And when I say a lot, in a typical year, maybe keynote 100 to 150 events. So on the road a lot. And every time you're on the road doing public speaking, it's a focus group, right? And I have found that, and Magic, I think you hit on this, but I think you were exactly right. Like 25% of the nation is so liberal. If I wanted to, I could tax their dreams too, if it was for the poor, starving children. That's all I'd have to say, and they'd be all for it. And then 25% of the country is so right-wing that I can get an additional tax dollar out of their dead hand when I pry it away with their gun. So, you know, that's 50% of the country that's extreme. And then there's 50% of the country somewhere between them that is rational, but doesn't get good information. And that's really where, if you want to do major policy change, so I was fortunate enough to be one of the two co-authors of the legislation, the evidence-based funding model that changed the state school funding formula, me and a guy named Mike Jacoby, who's with the Management Alliance. And I did it as technical advisor for State Senator Kim Lightford and State Representative Will Davis. You might know those. They are great Americans. And if you don't know them, you should know them. Those are really good elected officials. But we could get so far with that initiative. We worked on that for 7 years. We could only get so far appealing to people who really cared about education and equity in education. We couldn't get to that critical hump of enough support from both sides of the aisle to get a governor to be willing to sign the bill, until we flipped the discussion to focusing on the fact that this new formula would only fund those educational practices which the research showed had a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing student achievement, i.e. it only funded what worked. It was really hard for Democrats or Republicans to be against it, right? And so we took a lot of the equity and the you know, appeal to heartstrings, frankly, out of our framing and focused far more on the practical aspects of it, and that it was research and evidence-based. And one thing I found, and I'd love to hear this from the rest of the panel actually, because you all are engaged in policy, you all read stuff, and you're on the front lines. It's really interesting when you deal with the public on these issues. Tugging on the heartstrings, I don't know how far that gets you anymore. But breaking through their preconceived notions, and instead of trying to appeal to common values, I don't think people have common values, but I think people do have common self-perceptions, and most people perceive themselves to be fair. So if you could get them to be the arbiter that's making a decision to be fair in a policy change, you could win them over to support something that maybe cuts against their ideological worldview, but it takes a lot of work. I mean, this is part of the reason the fair tax effort lost. It was a bridge issue. And I think in addition to their failure as a field campaign, if they did fail as a field campaign, I think the messaging was really hard.
I agree that the evidence-based policy analysis frame works with my students. That's who I have the most. Those are my focus group. And I think the thing that has to push back against is the false information and the skepticism that so many people have of data. I mean, we know of a policy institute, another one that exists in Illinois that uses a lot of data to support their arguments, and it's real numbers. They don't make up the numbers, or maybe they do. You might know better
Well,
than
actually, sometimes they do, sadly, Magic. We've
that can be
debunked
a
a number of their things.
Well, and that's the problem, so voters have a hard time deciding, is this real data? I mean, I try to have students look at government produced data, like that's going to be better, but then, who's it produced by? And so I do think that is a way to bridge and appeal to people's rationality, and it only, works for certain types of issues. That's why it's really easy to mobilize people around morality-based issues as like the real sticking point, because there's no data or evidence that matters in those. It's just how you feel about this thing. And those are going to be polarized. But I think you're right. Use the data, and maybe we will get to a point. I mean, right, there's progress that happens with us as a civilization, I hope, and that we're not always stuck at this impasse where there's I don't know how large the group of the public is that would say, Matt might have seen public opinion data on this, that like doesn't think that there's factual information available. Like, I don't know how big that group is. Hopefully it's small. Hopefully it diminishes, with all this information. I hope that people aren't just throwing up their hands like, well, none of it's, I can't tell what's real. That would concern me. I hope that we can figure out what's fact versus fiction, and agree, but we're not seeing a lot of leadership on that right now. So it's hard.
So I don't want to interrupt this really great conversation. We are running a bit over. So I wanted to thank everybody. I feel like this is a really good note to end on, talking about polarization and some of the false information. I hope that this was helpful to everybody who attended, that you learned something today. So the AAUW members, I know, are hanging on the call because they actually are having their meeting on the call right after this. For those of you who aren't a part of the AAUW, we're done. And I guess there's no better way to put it. We're finishing up, but I really do want to thank our panelists so much for their insight. I know I learned a lot. I hope that everyone did. I know there's reactions. So either if you have your camera on, if you want to clap, or you can use the clap reaction. Thank you so much. It's just a little more awkward over Zoom. So thank you all so much. And we really appreciate you all. So thank you.